and that is the opening ceremony. So
Yeah.
this has been probably the biggest cultural story, at least from a Christian perspective. I think probably just culturally in general, from any perspective. It's
Yeah.
just sort of the opening ceremonies. They always spark discussion and stuff. They're supposed to. There's always the different things they can do. The spectacle, like whenever like they did London and the Queen's like bungee,
She's
like,
skydiving,
like from there's always stuff that stands out. Well, the highlight, or at least the one that sparked the most conversation and controversy for the Paris Olympics, has to do with a drag queen apparent mockery of Da Vinci's The Last Supper. And I think there were several different moments that all sort of tied into kind of a similar scenes and characters for that. But through the opening ceremonies, there is a moment where it seems like there's a bunch of like drag queens and they're sort of sitting around like a table, which is very like reminiscent of the the Lord's Supper painting by or Last Supper by Da Vinci. And then there's like other there's like a song performance where they're sort of like almost walking on a catwalk. And at one point there's like a guy that's painted blue and he's basically naked and he's singing or gyrating on the table or whatever he's doing. And as expected, like instant backlash, like I don't even know if they were probably still on screen.
Oh, I'm sure.
Like the social media feeds were just flooded with Christians this outraged about this and calling it disgusting and even calling for boycotts of the Olympics and what else, and just a lot of hot takes, a lot of heated opinions towards this. And as things have gone on, so that we get into sort of that moment of the opening ceremony and the response to it, and what as Christians, what should we, how should we process something like this? But it seems like we've got more context. In the last couple of days for this, I don't know if you want to get into this. Is it in fact Da Vinci's painting being explored?
Right. Yeah. So like that was at least the narrative, like right out of the gate. And like, if you look at any sort of even marginally conservative pundit or media outlet, it was like, they're mocking Christianity and the Last Supper by Da Vinci. But upon further analysis and as sort of the dust settles, we realized that no, in fact, it was the Feast of the Gods by a Dutch artist who I won't try and pronounce, but let's say his first name is Jan, and Jan van Bilge or Bilgert. I don't know how. Apologies to his family. He did this painting. It was sort of the Feast of the Gods, and it was supposed to be on Mount Olympus for the banquet of the marriage of Thetis and Peleus. I'm not super down with my Greek mythology, but anyway, so it was painted several hundred years after Da Vinci's Last Supper. And if you look at that painting, I think that you can see some inspiration from Da Vinci's Last Supper in the painting that the ceremony was. So there's like all these layers of reference, but like the ceremony was sort of taking it from that painting. And you can see the similarities in both the original painting and obviously the opening ceremony's depiction of that to the Last Supper. But it was, in fact, at least I think they probably knew that there would maybe be some upset people about how this does resemble the Last Supper. But I think the fact is that the intention was not, hey, let's poke fun at Christians and let's do the Last Supper, because it wasn't that.
And I mean, it makes more sense in context. This is the Olympics.
Yes.
This is a feast of the Olympians, like the gods,
of Greece, and it's like this is how it all started, like sort of the lore and the mythology of the Olympic Games.
Yeah, and like what that represents.
Because it would seem very like left field if it's like, let's also throw in a random painting who wasn't done by a French artist, but like, let's put it in here and make fun of Christians for a quick second, and then we'll move on with our show. It's like, I don't think that's what they were trying to do.
I mean, that's not going to stop people from.
No, people will. People will say that and believe that.
And again, like you said, the painting, the Feast of the Gods, that painting is housed in France. So it's like it wasn't done by a French artist, but like it's in, so there is more connections
Yeah.
that takes away some of the, I guess, this the random, like, oh, I guess they're just going to mock my faith now. I guess France hates
Yeah.
Christians, and some of that. So I guess it's sort of our question to get into, because I feel like there's a lot to get into with this. And I think the big thing for me is just like, is it a big deal, or is it like just a big overreaction to something? And I think there's two aspects to it as well. I think there's the side of just it's a bunch of drag queens and like half naked people and transgender people, like actors and stuff. And there's this like, and this parading, like very sexualized through all of that. Like, is that needed in an opening ceremony? Like, is that something that Christians should, speak out again? Like, there's sort of that side of it of just sort of
Yeah.
this, the sexualized nature of it. And I think the second part of it is the part that seems to be getting more airtime than the first of just like this is a direct mockery of Christianity. This is mocking this painting.
Yeah.
How dare they do that one thing? And I feel like you can sort of approach those differently. Like
Yeah.
You can have different reactions to that. But what would you say for because like I feel like and we've probably played our hand a little bit, but I think there are things for Christians to be like, okay, that's not right, or like that. There's kind of parading sin on display, and that's a testament to the times we live and where things are going. But there is some of that, but I feel like there's a whole lot of like totally over the top, knee jerk, like
Yeah.
rapid fire hot takes for something that just seems like isn't even necessarily like factually accurate.
Yeah. That pretty much that pretty much sums it up. I mean, again, like this, we're gonna sound like a broken record, but once again, like Christians getting outraged, I think, over the wrong thing, and so I mean, everywhere you look, it's just like, oh, how dare they mock Christianity, and there's just very like, I would say almost holy war type rhetoric around this thing, like, you know, heads are gonna roll because you mocked this most sacred painting of ours. This is representative of the Last Supper. And it's like, wait a second. Like, first of all, it wasn't a mockery of that painting, despite however you feel and, whatever your first hot take was, since you don't want to go back on that, that doesn't change the facts. And I think the other thing is when you make such a big deal out of something that was you were factually inaccurate about, and make it this huge thing, well, then you don't really have the credibility to push back in the ways that I think Christians should push back. And that goes back to the sort of the unnecessarily sexualization of the opening ceremony. And I think that is a place where we could say, hey, like, that's unnecessary. We don't need that, especially if this is going out to families and kids. That's certainly something that I think is a legitimate criticism of the opening ceremonies. But now, because you've made this whole Last Supper thing, this just blown it way out of proportion for a thing that wasn't even the intention. Well, you kind of lost your credibility to push back in other ways that I think are more legitimate to the opening ceremonies and all of that. And so I think it is an enormous overreaction, and it's really puzzling to me because a lot of people who hold this view, I would say are typically very smart people. But like from the get-go, people have just seemed very dug in on this point, and it's just kind of odd to me to watch it unfold.
I think part of it is just like it's birthed out of this sort of this cultural moment we're in, where I just feel like victimhood is like a serious drug. Like there's some aspect of, again, like, there is persecution, like like real persecution where Christians are dying in the world. People are since Jesus himself was crucified. There's been that kind of persecution, but there is this sense that I just feel like as Christians we can be so soft. Like we can, like if you think of, like the early church, like they're like, literally like having their friends ripped from their homes and like fed to lions and stuff, and just like living the faith. Where like today it's like, when like the majority of the world is at least nominally somewhat religious or
Yeah.
Christian, like, but then someone, seems to mock a painting or something, and like we just fall apart, and it's
Yeah.
like,
Well, they're acting like soccer players. You know, it's like, oh, you brush past me and now I have a broken arm, and it's like, come on, like, and again, this goes back to this idea that like Christians are outraged that how dare the world, how dare lost humanity act like lost humanity? Don't you guys know any better? It's like, no, they don't, and like that's the whole point. And do you think being outraged about this is like, how is that helping your cause, and how is that helping, spread the gospel? I think maybe in fact it's doing the opposite. And so it's just sort of like, I don't know. I get frustrated about reactions like this to these sort of things.
Well, I think the part that gets me too is like, again, like, it's not wrong to have even strong feelings against something. We're like, hey, that's sinful. I wish, that bothers me. I wish that wasn't there. Like, we're not saying that like that isn't okay.
Right.
That Christians should just, well, that's the way the world is. Like, just step back and like, no, like Christians should be engaged. The part that bothers me is just that, like, I feel like so much of it is disingenuous. Like, it's this sort of machine of outrage and persecution and like kind of culture war where like, are people really, was their faith shaken? Are we really worried that, 7 seconds in an opening ceremony of showing this, a recreation of a painting that was inspired by a Christian painting done by an artist that probably wasn't even Christian. Like,
Yeah.
like, are we really that concerned that, we're just disgusted and we just can't, we need to raise a big outrage and, that's just going to consume us for days. Like, I don't think we are. Like, I think what we are, what we are fueled by is just some of that culture war, like some of that.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another example of this sort of this perverted world, secular world, and like we need to to march against this. And like, the verse that constantly gets, at least in my own feeds, quote is, people will say, God will not be mocked. Which is sort of taken from Galatians 6, where it says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows, whatever sows to please their flesh. From their flesh will reap destruction. Whoever sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. And a lot of people like constantly pull, not even just for this, but like for these sort of, like, God will not be mocked. And
Yeah.
but I feel like they're taking that verse in a way that wasn't being used in Galatians.
Which
like,
is why I'm on here yelling at you about why I'm so mad.
I feel like sort of that God will not be mocked gets taken by a lot of like, as like a rallying cry of like, we need to go and like put down the riots and put down, the rebellion against God. And like, we need to, quelch that because God's not going to be mocked and we're not going to let you mock him. Where like the verse is saying like, no, like God is the judge. Like,
Yeah.
People can mock him. Like people, the verse implies people will be mocking God, but like one day we all die. We all end up before the throne of heaven. And like, God's not going to be mocked in the throne of heaven. Like, that's the verse of like, hey, God can handle himself. Like, I feel like as Christians, we almost treat him like he's sort of this like pipsqueak, guy, and we got to go defend him from all these cultural bullies and punch him down because God is too small to like fight his own battles. And I feel like this verse is saying the exact opposite of that.
Yeah, and I think you see that like again, and we've talked about this on here before, but the sort of marriage between sort of right-wing conservatism and Christianity. This is, I think, a great example of where those lines kind of get blurred because it is very much language that is more about like political right-wing or conservatism and not so much Christianity. Because a lot of these folks, I don't think are really concerned with Christianity because I think they're taking sort of the opposite approach to defending the faith, if you will. And it's really more aligned with this sort of conservatism, sort of right-wing, anti-woke, whatever movement that's happening. And so I think it's another example of sort of that blending that I think just doesn't really do anybody favors, again, except for those who make their livelihood off of farming outrage, thanks to the internet and social media. And so all of those things, I think, come together to sort of make this sort of toxic soup of what we have that lacks all nuance. And again, we're not surprised about that, but it's just another example of why that, maybe wait a day or two, like think it over before you like post your hot take. But again, if your goal is for clicks and for engagement, then you got to be the first one to sort of say these things. And then if they stick, then, your channel blows up, or, you're making a lot more money from ad revenue because you're doing this online. And so it's all these things that kind of, I think, come together to, I think, make a less than ideal response from like Christendom to sort of what's perceived as a mockery of our religion.
Yeah, because I feel like this has just become such a case study for that. It was just like, if you're just looking for ammo to fight this sort of cultural war, but I kind of think of, and there's almost a sense that, like sexual perversion in culture is like, that was invented 5 years ago, and like some new thing we got to deal with. And like just go just like Google the stuff that was going on, in like the first like the early church. Like, it's it's not like we just discovered, it might have looked different, but like, there's a lot of sexually perverted stuff happening right around, like literally, like in temples by where the above Corinth or some of these churches, and you can kind of glean some of that from like Paul's letters. And I kind of think, what would the church then's response be? Like, because they were surrounded by that too. Like, like obviously they would say that's wrong, that's sinful. Like, they wouldn't compromise on that. But like, would they just sort of gather and just get mad at like?
Would they go like,
how dare that pagan temple down the street is like having
petition
religious prostitutes and stuff, like how
were they petitioning Domitian and saying, hey pal, we're not going to take it anymore? And so it's like, no, I don't think they would have.
I just don't feel like the early church spent a whole lot of time. I don't think they had the luxury to spend a lot of time just gathering together and like getting mad at stuff. Like, I feel like
again,
they were like
getting mad at the pagan world for being the pagan world. It's like that to me is a relatively new thing within Christianity, is the outrage at pagans acting like pagans. It's like, you're surprised? Like, what did you think? Like, you thought they, had a moral compass? Like, you thought they were going to behave like good Christians? Like, so to me, that is maybe something that is somewhat new in this whole just dialogue, I guess, would be how upset Christians get when the world acts like the world.
Yeah, like France is one of the most like least religious group countries in Europe. Like,
despite their history of they have a long history of religion, but it's very not religious.
Yeah, as far as like attendance in active, that kind of like belonging into like religious bodies or whatever is extremely low. So should it surprise us that their sort of ideologies of this city, the city of love or whatever it is, like that represents things that isn't consistent with how we would orthodox kind of biblical theology. But again, I think there's a lot to that. We don't need to spend more time on it. But I think the big takeaway for me is just there's no harm done, and I would even say there's plenty of value in just taking a deep breath, not typing something, and just thinking about it. Like, just maybe you think about it and you're still like, what, I am still mad. I'm still like, I want to go speak my give my 2 cents, but just sort of that. We don't need to always be mad about stuff. Like, I feel like we're wasting a lot of time doing more valuable stuff by just kind of getting the choir together and just all, having that sort of therapy session of how we're all mad at the same thing. Like, we don't need to do that. I think there's more important things that we are called to. But one of the things